Hello and welcome back to Microsoft Server Administration 2. My name is Nick. The topic of the video is adding a domain controller to an existing domain. There are a few requirements before we get started. First of all, there obviously has to be a domain controller already existing. In my case, that would be my HQ-DC1 server that I have already turned into a domain controller. The second requirement is that there has to be a server providing DNS services. That also happens to be this very same HQ-DC1 server. We have an Active Directory and DNS domain namespace of Contasso.com. The next requirement is that on your secondary server you should have already installed Windows 2008 or 2 and configured IP addressing information on that server. Now, you're going to notice that my IP addresses are in different networks. That is because I do have two different subnets and I am routing between those subnets with a server. You guys don't have to worry about that right now. However, some of you, if you get done with all your coursework early, I will end up assigning you a case study where you can do this very thing, setting up two different networks. So we'll get to that a little later, but the requirement here is that we have to have configured IP addressing information on our server. And what I mean by that in a little bit more detail, I'm going to do ncpa.cpl to open network connections on this second box here. And I'm going to go to the properties of my local area connection and look at the IP version 4 properties. Now, in this particular network, I actually had this box set up for something else originally, and so what I have here, my secondary box, it's in the 172.16.1 subnet, and its IP address is 11. And to get out of my network, I actually have to use a default gateway here of .1. Now, this server has to know where the domain controller lives. In order to join a domain, this server has to do a DNS lookup. Initially for an SRV record, he's going to ask DNS, is there anyone providing DNS or Kerberos services, authentication services in my network? And DNS is going to look at his SRV records and say, yes, I have HQ-DC1. My A record for HQ-DC1 says you can find those services here at 192.168.1.11. And so this server will then contact that IP address to talk about Active Directory services. So this server must know how to contact a DNS server for the Contasso.com domain. At its current point, it does not know how to contact a DNS server. So we are going to tell it how to do that. So we have to input the IP address of a DNS server serving DNS for the Contasso.com domain. That happens to be the IP address of my main server over here, 192.168.1.11. So I have all my IP addressing configured properly. I'm going to press OK on that and lock that in with the close button. So at this point, my second server here should be able to contact my primary server. And to test that theory, I'm going to use the command prompt. We're going to do a simple ping command. This is going to send a few IP packets at the other machine. I'm going to ping the server's name of HQ-DC1. So HQ-DC1, and this will tell me an awful lot here whether I can contact the machine. And actually I get replies from the IP address. What this is doing, it's pinging that name, and if DNS is working properly, it will translate that name into some form of an IP address and give a response back. Now this is actually translating it into an IP version 6 address, which is perfectly okay for me as long as I got replies. That tells me DNS is operating, it's translating the names into IP addresses. So we are actually on the right track here. Now let's go in and install the Active Directory role on this server, promote it to a domain controller, and we're going to see how to add an additional domain controller to our domain. So our server's name here is Chicago-DC1. He lives in a site in Chicago, and we're simply going to run the DC Promo Wizard, and it's going to install some binaries here. Binaries are installed. We are actually going to use the advanced mode installation. So we don't have to use that to add an additional domain controller. I just want to use that mode at this particular time. It gives us a few extra options. Next, here's the warning about older domain controllers or older servers in our network. And here is the screen that matters for right now. The first domain controller we install in a network, we would choose the create a new domain option. But for additional domain controllers in existing domain, we're going to choose the existing forest. We have a forest already out there, and add a domain controller to an existing domain. So I'm going to choose the next button there, and I want to type in the name of any domain in the forest where I want to make this a DC. Well, the only domain I have right now is Contasso.com. So I'm going to type in the domain name of Contasso.com, and this server is going to have to somehow authenticate with the domain. So I have to know a user account inside the Contasso.com domain. Now I haven't really created any additional user accounts in my domain at this time, so all I have right now is the built-in administrator of the domain called administrator. So this server will have to authenticate with that domain, and you have to use a user account, specifically a user account which has enough privileges to add domain controllers, and the built-in administrator account is plenty sufficient for that. So I'm going to set my credentials here by the set button. We see the domain we're bouncing authentication information off of is Contasso.com. I'm going to type the username of administrator, and the password is password1 in my case. Okay on that, and that locks in the authentication information for this particular session. And I'm going to press next on that. And if your password was wrong, it would have told you before you got to this point. So we know our password was correct in this case, and if you have more than one domain, it would show you right here if you had any child domains or anything. So we're going to choose the Contasso.com domain. Next on that, and I've actually created a couple of sites already in my Active Directory, and in my Active Directory I have created some subnets. We will actually go over sites and subnets later. On your machines you will not have multiple sites. You will have one called default first site name, and I have renamed that to headquarters. So I'm choosing my default built-in site here, and we'll go over the creation of sites later on. So headquarters, in your case, default first site name. Next on that, and here is where we can choose to install additional features or roles if we want to. I am going to untick the DNS server because that's a whole other video to install DNS server as a secondary um, zone. So I'm going to leave that off for right now on this particular server, but I'm going to keep the global catalog ticked for now. So next on that, and this is where Active Directory really shines. We can have multiple servers providing Active Directory, obviously, because we're doing this. Um, but Active Directory is a database, and we can have multiple servers serving this database. And the database has to be in sync. All the information and all the copies of the database have to be the same. And it keeps that information in sync by a process called replication. So when information changes on one domain controller, that information is replicated to the other domain controllers in the network across sites and what have you. So it's asking me right now, how do you want to synchronize the database from the existing domain controller? Do you want to replicate information across the network from the existing domain controller, or have you already got a file that you've replicated out and you want to use that file to load the latest Active Directory data? I'm going to choose the first option here, replicating across the network. But if you are doing this in a very busy network and replication traffic would cause more latency on your network than you really want, you might have already done the export, and it might help you to do a local load of the Active Directory data. So I'm going to replicate across the network from the existing domain controller. And next on that, so this is going to choose a replication partner. So if you have more than just 2 domain controllers, say you have 3, 4, 5 domain controllers, you could choose which domain controller this server would replicate information with. In our case, we only have one choice here, HQDC1. That is our only other domain controller in the site, so we really has no other choice. So next on that, and here is the default database log and sysvol locations for our information on this particular server, leaving those at default. Here is the Active Directory restore mode password. I think I harped on this enough, but make sure this is a secure password and make sure you keep it safe and secure so you can retrieve it in case the stuff hits the fan and you have to restore Active Directory from a backup. In this case, mine is password 1 because we are in a lab environment. Next on that, there is our summary, and next to start the process off. Now, once this gets finished, it will prompt us for a reboot. Okay, the wizard has finished. I'm going to press the finish button and press the restart now. Okay, the computer is now restarted. I'm going to go ahead and log in. Now we see that the server is now logging in on the Contasso domain. So I'm going to use the password for the administrator account in the Contasso domain. Okay, we are logged in, and now if I go to my administrative tools under the start menu, and Active Directory users and computers is now present, I can open that up and look in my contasso.com domain in my users container, and we see if we compare this to the server, the HQ-DC1 I have over here, on my user list is the same, and I can check out all my domain settings and they will be the same. So that's really all there is to adding a second domain controller to an existing domain. And we will cover some other more advanced topics later on. If you have any questions, as always, please hit me up via email or just bring the questions to class and we will discuss them there. I will see you in class and thank you for watching.